I am Indy Nidell, and this is another exciting edition of Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in the chair of wisdom and answer your questions about the First World War. Domi Yonsi, or Johnsy, says, "Hi, Indian crew." Hey, crew.
Hi.
Yep. I have a question for Out of the Trenches. How efficient was the Royal Mail Postal Services across all fronts, I guess, and how much did they affect morale? Crucially, it might be hard for you younger folk out there, but I want you to imagine a time when there was no social media, no smartphones, the TV wasn't invented, radio was a new thing and could not yet broadcast the human voice anyway, and telephone lines were for military use only. The only thing you had as a soldier in those times were the chatter with your fellow comrades and a few newspapers, and they were written with carefully selected and biased articles. But writing and reading postcards and letters was essentially the only connection to the world outside the war. Soldiers wrote daily, often several times a day, and received the same amount from people back home. The British Royal Mail Postal Service sent out over 12 million pieces of mail a week. The Home Depot was centralized in London, where like 2,500 employees sent the mail overseas to the Army Post Office. The process was pretty similar in all warring countries, where the mail was then sorted and given out to the battalions and divisions until it reached its destination. Even up to the frontline trenches when it was possible. Not only letters or postcards, but parcels, photographs, and little gifts. Around Christmas especially, when French authorities would send out up to 60,000 parcels a day, and up to 500,000 mail bags were shipped out from Britain across the Channel. This was immensely important for morale. Delays or the threat of withholding mail from the soldiers could easily swing the mood towards open rebellion. That's why all the governments were concerned about an efficient mail delivery service and also provided postcards to the soldiers. Austria-Hungary gave out 800,000 different mass-produced propaganda postcards to its soldiers. For Germany alone, I have seen estimates that up to 28 billion letters or packages were transported throughout the war. Okay, that sounds really high to me, but what do I know? The postal services were among the most efficient and well-organized organizations, and soldiers, yes, they treasured that immensely. Manfred von Richthofen wrote, okay. Yeah, wrote from beyond the grave. Wait, okay. Can you make it look spooky? Okay, cool. Recently I learned the USAF wasn't founded until 1947, and the US Army Air Corps wasn't founded until 1926. What organization were American pilots a part of in World War I? That's a good question for the Red Baron to actually be writing from beyond the grave. And he says, thanks and keep up the great work. Thank you, Baron, and I hope you rest in peace. The history of the United Air Force really began in 1907 with the foundation of the Aeronautical Division, which was part of the Signal Corps, surprisingly enough. This was because the Signal Corps had incorporated balloons as part of their reconnaissance and communications. There were plans for building up a war balloon department, but thanks to the foresight of President Theodore Roosevelt, in 1908, the Aeronautical Division began focusing on aircraft instead, and bought its first plane from the Wright brothers. Planes at that time were incredibly expensive, and Congress had only cautiously granted the acquisition of a handful of planes and integrated them as scouts into the Signal Corps. In July 1914, the U.S. built up the aviation section of the Signal Corps as they recognized the value of aircraft as an active weapon. But attempts to separate it from the Signal Corps, they totally failed. Nonetheless, the aviation section was expanded with volunteers from the Army and saw its first engagement in the punitive expedition of Major General Pershing against Pancho Villa's forces in Mexico in March 1916. With mixed results, since the planes could not really be maintained during the expedition, and they couldn't really be much use in the strong winds of the passes. The U.S. had really fallen behind in terms of modern aircraft at this point, but after its entry into the Great War, a reorganization process began. The creation of the Division of Military Aeronautics was one of those aviation organizations, but hey, it was shut down after only 4 days in May 1918. Presumably before it could turn into another bureaucratic nightmare. Instead, by executive order of President Wilson, they formed the U.S. Army Air Service, and this was the real birthplace of an independent U.S. Air Force with its own identity. Lefty CDN writes, "Hi Indian crew." Hi Lefty. I was wondering how the soldiers would get to the front and into the trenches. Yeah, okay, good question. Since any soldier spotted above the trench would be gunned down, how would they get in? All right, I'm going to try to describe the typical Western Front deployment scenario, okay? From their quarters in bigger cities, they would be sent to the outskirts of the front, usually via railway, and then to march to the nearest rally point, sometimes by buses or carriages if they got lucky. The rally points in those outskirts were often villages or military outposts, which were close enough to the front that they could see the impact of the artillery like thunderclaps on the horizon, but far enough away to be out of immediate danger. There, the soldiers were grouped into smaller units and assigned to specific trench sections. Their officers then led them into the reserve trenches. Usually, they would have waited until the evening, and then they would proceed forward towards the actual front line. From the reserves onward to the second line, they could cross pretty well-built communication trenches without the danger of being spotted or shelled. But it got more dangerous the closer they got to the front lines. The actual relief of the troops in the first line could only happen in the dark of night, often at a snail's pace and, from shell hole to shell hole, stopping every now and then to avoid detection, because getting spotted or illuminated by a flare would mean enemy artillery fire raining down on their position. The relieved soldiers would do the same, stay low profile until they reach the second line. If you'd like to see our special about trench raiding and trench raiding techniques, you can click right here for that. And you can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and check out our Instagram. Yeah, cool stuff happens if you do that. Trust me. See you next time.